All right. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining us. And once again, we seem to have a track record of this. Technical difficulties. This time the technical difficulties had nothing to do with the camera or the laptop or the live stream. It had to do with air conditioning. So we've got that resolved, and now we're ready to launch. Patrice, would you open in prayer, please?
Avinu Malchenu, our Father and our King, we thank you and praise you that we can worship you, especially today, and that we can learn more about you. Help us and guide us to speak about wise things and to reach out to you to give us the answers in life. Thank you. B'Shem Yeshua, Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen. Okay. And that being said, we're ready to launch. We have some questions, one from about a month ago and one from a number of months ago that we're going to get into. But what we'd like to do is to start with, to see if those of you who are either with us in the room here or on the screen, if you've got any questions, because we like to give first preference to those who are actually here.
No, I'm good.
You're good?
You're good right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something will come up.
We'll ask.
Stuff that comes up.
Jessica, any questions coming from you as we start?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment. And Betty? Not there either. Okay.
All right.
Then, the question goes, I studied Kabbalah about 10 years ago, but a Messianic rabbi told me it was dangerous. I stopped and don't remember much about it. My attempt was to learn something new. I understand that the Hasids follow Kabbalah closely. Does Kabbalah have any value? Usual rabbinic answer, and an easy one, is yes and no. And to that I'll add, and maybe so. But it's a broad question, so let me just paint a little bit of a background. First of all, Kabbalah or Kabbalah, depending on who's pronouncing it, has to do with the whole realm of mystical literature that has been on the edges of Judaism, if not a little further than just the edges of Judaism, for centuries and centuries. The main book of Kabbalah is, or the best-known book is the Zohar, arising from the Kabbalistic tradition. Now, the tradition is that the Zohar goes back to the time of Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, so he's a second century rabbi. Now, the interesting thing about Bar Yochai, by way of aside, is Lag BaOmer. 33rd, yeah. Lag BaOmer is a special day during the counting of the Omer.
In the spring.
In the spring, where we usually remember that the onslaught against the students of Rabbi Akiva ceased then, because they were being slaughtered by the Romans up till then. This was during the second revolt against Rome. But the other thing that's commemorated at Lag BaOmer is, in fact, the death of Shimon Bar Yochai. And the first event, obviously, would be something to celebrate. Normally, we would think that the second event, the death of a prominent rabbi, would be not something you would want to celebrate. But Bar Yochai told his students that they should not mourn his death, but in fact should greet or celebrate his death, because he was now going on, we used the term last night, to be gathered to his people. In other words, actually to be with his people and to meet his maker. So Lag BaOmer became a time of celebration during the counting of the Omer. Shimon Bar Yochai is reputed to be the author of much of the Kabbalistic material, particularly the Zohar. There's one problem with it. The Zohar has been fairly conclusively demonstrated to be 13th century in origin. Now remember again, Bar Yochai died on Lag BaOmer in the 2nd century. Obviously, it does not come from him, although some teachings may be partially attributable to him. Kabbalistic teaching in general tends to be what we would call in a broader sense Gnostic or Gnostic-like, in that there are levels of knowledge that you go through to attain a greater understanding of the divine and to therefore live a more powerful life before him in a mystical, in that sense, spiritual sense. So you, in a sense, climb the ladder, so to speak, as you get this greater knowledge. And again, that whole concept of climbing the ladder of knowledge and therefore experience is very much Gnostic in its origin and in its perspective. Okay. Now, that does not mean that everything in there is to be shied away from. It does mean that there are some interesting and important things that Kabbalah and the Zohar teach us. Just by way of an aside, since we want to start with the positive side, is interestingly enough, Kabbalah does provide a sense concerning the nature of God, of the threeness of the nature of God. I wish I could quote the text precisely, but I didn't grab the book where I have it quoted. But anyhow, it is something that we go into when we deal with the deity, supernatural nature, or the deity of the Messiah from the Jewish sources. This is one of the Jewish sources. It's so there is the Kabbalistic notion of the threeness of the nature of God in some sense. So there is some stuff in there. It would be well, however, to heed the advice of the ancient rabbis concerning mystical material, and particularly Kabbalah, and that is that before you interact with this material, you're supposed to have been a teacher for 40 years, and you're supposed to have become a master of the Talmud. Once you've done that, then you are better prepared to sift through the various parts of the Kabbalistic material in a way so you can discern what is good and what is not about it. Is there more I want to say about Kabbalah at this point? So, yeah, like I said, heed the warning. Unless you're a master, it's going to you are not really equipped to discern between the good and the bad. There is good in there. There is a lot of stuff that is not so good because of its basic Gnostic kind of approach. Now, the Chassidim, but particularly the Lubavitcher version of Chassidim, tend to be more Kabbalistically oriented than the rest of people, the rest of the various branches or sub-branches of Judaism. So that part is correct. So the answer to the question is, does Kabbalah have any value? Yes, it does, but you need to know how to use it. You need to be careful how you use it. You need to be aware of the fact that there is a lot of stuff that's questionable in it, and its basic overriding perspective tends to be questionable in and of itself. And as I said, Zohar, 13th century, Shimon Bar Yochai, the reputed author of it, died in Lag BaOmer, 2nd century. So I can't think of anything else to address at this point.
I'm going to ask you a question,
Okay.
though, about it. So is there anything that you can think of in the Siddur, in the prayer books that we use every, Friday night and Saturday, that would come from the Kabbalah? I don't know. I'm not setting you up.
That's no, it's a good setup question though. The answer to that is yes, again, yes and no. Not directly from Kabbalah, but from the mystic tradition comes Lachadodi.
Right.
I am thinking Lachadod, I have to double check this because it's been a long time since I've looked at it. Lachado D is certainly no later than the time of the Zohar, but I'm thinking Lachado D can go back, and I'm right. Yeah, I am vague. Suddenly, that's it. Yitzhak of Luria, got it. I think is related. I think he may be responsible for the thoughts that are part of Lachado D. And I think Yitzhak of Luria is 7th century.
So, I'm just gonna briefly explain what Lachadodi is for
Please
people.
do. And while you're doing that, I'm going to see if I can quickly find that quote from the
Okay.
Zohar that I mentioned.
Lachadodi is a traditional song that's sung on Shabbat. That's based on a concept that Shabbat is a queen, and she is to be welcomed into the building and the Torah place that you are sitting in the congregation. And it's just a very, it's a lovely idea. It's not lovely because she's dressed in a feminine background. So Shabbat in a certain way is a feminine, it's drawing out feminine ideas. But it is to actually, it serves to get people ready to then worship on Shabbat. So it's a preparatory thing. As you at a wedding in the West, when the bride comes to the open door in the back of wherever the wedding is, accompanied usually by her father or father and mother, and starts to walk down the aisle, it's that moment that you're singing about. You're welcoming. You at a wedding, you stand up and maybe nod to the bride as she walks down the aisle toward the groom, or you just have a moment of pause and reverence to remember what you're witnessing. And I think all of those things apply to what Lachadodi functions as. So if that's helpful to anybody, I hope it is. That's what Lachadodi is. It is very mystical. I mean, if you think about, here comes Shabbat, and she's like a queen, and now we're all going to greet her, and isn't she beautiful? Well, it's all a big fat metaphor. But it puts you in the right frame of mind for the amount of joy and respect that we have for Shabbat.
And if you're not familiar with the words of Lachadodi, either because you haven't paid careful enough attention or couldn't remember it well from our services, or haven't had a chance to interact with it, there's some wonderful images and selections from the prophets that are highly messianic in Lachadodi. We sang it last night, Arise, shine, your light has come. That comes directly from Isaiah 61. 60? And it was somewhere between 60 and 62. Jesse's son, the Bethlehemite, draws near, bringing us redemption. Again, wonderful messianic imagery throughout the whole of Lachadodi. Now, I was able to find the quote that I was looking for. It's in a very
It's in the book that you wrote.
It's in that very, very famous book, The Olive Tree Connection, written by the world-renowned author John Fisher. Anyhow,
Many years.
Here's what the Zohar says. Why is there need of mentioning the name of God 3 times in the verse, talking about the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4? The first, Adonai, is the Father above. The second is the stem of Jesse. Remember, stem of Jesse we just talked about in
Branch of Jesse.
Branch of Jesse. The Messiah, who is to come from the family of Jesse through David. And the third one is the way which is below. And these 3 are one. Not a Catholic catechism, not a creed of the early church, but a text in the Zohar. So there you have it. So there is good, but again, you need a guide when you make your way through Jewish mysticism, particularly the Zohar and Kabbalah. Okay, any questions arising from that brief, very brief discussion of Kabbalah, mysticism, Zohar, etc.
There was a time that a lot of the Hollywood personalities were wearing the red string around the wrist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't hear about that anymore, but at one time everybody was doing it. And is that part of the Kabbalah, is to wear that? Or
That's what the red bracelet made out of braided thread. That's
Yes.
where that comes from.
Yeah.
My understanding is there was a very, very popular rabbi who didn't mind all these Gentiles coming to him and asking him questions, and he was very charismatic, not in a general way. People were drawn to him. I don't know if he's no longer with us. I don't know if he's no longer working there. Madonna was one of the people who really was tied in with that. I said tied in with that. And I right now I'm forgetting other people, but there were other people. Yeah, I think it's because that particular rabbi was telling them things that they wanted to hear, and probably we would like to hear that too. But and he was emphasizing the Jewish roots of a true faith in God to the many Gentiles who thought this was way cool. But you're right. I haven't heard about that whole movement in several years.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I don't know what happened to him.
It was it was very popular, not just among those people associated with Hollywood. It was popular across a wide spectrum of people who were intrigued by Kabbalah. And
Because it's spooky. So that draws people right there. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, it has secret stuff in it. Ooh, well, we better find out about that because that sounds cool.
yeah, the whole mystical element is what drew a lot of these people there. Yes, a lot of famous people became students of Kabbalah in one fashion or another. So yes, that's correct.
I don't know if they may still keep it up and not talk about it.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much.
Mhm, you're welcome. Okay. Any other questions arising from that discussion? Skylar was there.
Busy head.
Had his
munchkin.
had his hands full with a munchkin, yeah.
That's right.
Skylar, since you are here with us as well, even though it is virtually, but it is in real time, we like to leave the floor open for questions coming from those who are actually in real time participating. So if there's any questions coming from you, if you got a question, shoot it at us. Don't shoot us, but shoot it at us.
So violent.
Sounds good.
All right, cool. Okay. Then, from many months ago, we received a series of questions, and as I looked at them recently, I think there were either 7 or 8 questions arising from this one email that we got, and we've been able to go through, I think, almost all of them, with the exception of one.
Gotcha.
Yes. And let me,
If you can find it.
I can find it pretty readily. Let me see if I can find, yes. And what I want to do is to phrase the question exactly as it was phrased. Okay. I want to ask a little more about Bibles, specifically some newer versions, including some compiled by Messianic Jews. Tree of Life Bible, things that are great things to watch for. Messianic Jewish Study Bible, things that are great things to watch for. The ESV, English Standard Version, things that are great things to watch for. And finally, what versions do you tend to bounce back and forth with? And that last part was very perceptive. We do tend to bounce back and forth with and among the various translations. And by the way, this question came from someone who was at one time not only a member of the synagogue, but was also a student, and hopefully will return to his studies with the seminary and yeshiva. So that's why he was a little familiar with how we approach things. Do you want to start with the broader picture of the different kinds of translations?
Well, I would make a general statement.
Yes.
First.
Yes, that's
Here's your general statement. I'm going to start with Messianic versions.
You want to start there? Sure.
Yeah, just because that's what people think they want to know about.
Okay. Before you do, a quick preliminary clarification. To be completely transparent, both Patrice and I were involved with both of the Messianic translations, both the Messianic Study Bible and the Tree of Life Bible, both by way of translation, by way of overseeing parts, by way of notes that are parts of both of those. So
And by writing essays,
yes,
I think in both of them.
in both of them. So we do have a hands-on experience with both, and we'll try not to let that color our response as we talk.
Well, no, I mean, eventually I'm going to say why I feel
Yeah, go ahead.
uncomfortable, but I'm not right now.
Not right now.
I don't know. So when you see in catalogs or on the internet or whatever, Messianic Bibles, what can you expect to get out of a Messianic Bible as opposed to your general Bible that would have the Older and the Newer Testament in them? Why would you spend money on them? So I think people assume that in the Messianic Bibles, you're going to have an emphasis on Messianic Judaism. Yes and no. People also might assume that the language would be more Jewish friendly. In other words, it's pretty obvious that certain terms and phrases within Christianity are not going to be. It's not just that they're not popular; they can be offensive to Jewish people. And so you might pick up a Messianic Bible and assume that it would help with some of this language that offends Jewish people. What else might you expect from a Messianic? That it would have explanations of Jewish stuff in it more than your average Christian Bible. You might think it would be easier to understand because it has footnotes and possibly language translations in it that would be conducive to more understanding how Judaism fits in with Christianity. And I don't think, and there's more than two Jewish Bibles. I mean, Messianic Jewish Bibles. There's also the Living Scriptures,
That's right.
And there's another one even,
Yes, I'm trying to
too.
remember what it is.
So he'll remember. We didn't work on that other one. We
No.
didn't work on the Living Scriptures one. That's from the 80s. But our boss, Dr. David Brownstein, did work from that scripture. If you assume that it would help you in any of those areas, yeah, sort of. It might. But it might just sort of reiterate something that is not as helpful and somewhat wrong slanted too. Just because John and I were on the team that sort of produced this does not mean that we particularly like either of the two main ones that are out now, which is the Tree of Life and the Complete Messianic Jewish Bible. And it's not because we don't like the people involved in either of those. We like the people involved. But when you're publishing something, when you're publishing a book, when you hand the author or the compiler hands the book over to the printing department and the business department of whoever is responsible for printing this and delivering it to thousands of people, then the author or the compiler loses control of it. And it's at that point that both John and I have been burned. So we were told, well, we couldn't fit this in, or we asked this other person to do it instead of what you did, or there's a lot of different reasons that you're given after you give it over to the publisher. So it's never the editor's fault. It's always somebody else messed it up. And I think it's fair to say that in both the Messianic Bibles that we're talking about now, John and I were very disappointed in the
Final outcome.
final outcome. Extremely disappointed. So let me just say that that's part of the business of printing books. And happy are the authors and the compilers, the editors, who can give what they've produced over to the business side of who's producing it, and that the business side treats it with kindness and respect. That would be the positive thing. However, in these two Bibles that we're referring to, evidently the business side was not very careful about what they were producing. Is that fair enough to say in
Sure.
general terms?
Okay.
Okay.
While you're at it, why don't you go ahead and talk in terms about the different styles of translation?
Yes. When we talk about, this is about translating in general. So, and I think it's something we came up with a long time ago, like decades ago, but it's still applicable. When we say, so for many, many people, when they listen to somebody speaking who seem to be an expert, or they listen to a pastor, or they listen to a theologian, here's what you often hear. You want to stick with a word for word translation. That seems to be the Mount Zion of translations, is the word for word translation. And where people go wrong, it seems, is they don't stick with a word for word translation. Let me explain that there is no such thing as a word for word translation. Because if you have a word for word translation from Hebrew into English or from Greek into English, you most likely will not be able to understand what it's saying, because the syntax of Hebrew and the syntax of Greek are so different from English. They're so different. So there is no advantage to what hypothetically is called a word for word translation. You can buy something called an interlinear Bible. In fact, I recommend that you do. You can find an interlinear Bible for the New Testament, which is in Greek, and you can find an interlinear for the Old Testament, which would be Hebrew. And what it does is it has one line of Greek, and then under it, it's placed the English words like underneath exactly the words on the text, and the next line of Greek, and then underneath that, it has the words, and then they put in parentheses words that you need to have in English that don't occur in Greek, and they skip some words. So that's not even a word for word translation, because if you read the English out loud, it makes very little sense. So what can you do? What are we supposed to do? What is the best form of translating that will help people who don't know the two languages the most? Understanding that Greek scholars sometimes know very little about Hebrew, and that Hebrew scholars know very little about Greek. So now you're stuck, because it's a whole different team of guys, or usually guys. And what you would get out of their translation depends on the quality of their translation. The closest thing and the most accurate way to judge a translation is by the different methods that are used. You're going different methods? Well, the different designations for translations. And by that I mean, you could have a paraphrase. So you could have one sentence in Greek, and then the Greek scholar or group would read that sentence in Greek, and they would say what it means to them in simplified English. That would be a sentence for sentence equivalency. You can have a paragraph for paragraph equivalency where you read the paragraph in Greek and then you write a paragraph in English that describes or enumerates that paragraph for English speakers. That would be the paraphrase, which is the first one we talked about. That would be, could you find vocabulary words in Hebrew or Greek that you would recognize in the Greek text? Would you find them in the English text? Maybe not. No, maybe not. Am I explaining this very well? Not very well.
No, I think you
All
are.
right. So what's the next level? You would say phrase for sentence for sentence.
Yeah, word for word, sentence for sentence.
Phrase for phrase is in there too.
Oh, phrase for phrase, sentence for sentence, yes. And you said paragraph for paragraph. Just like we were saying, a straightforward paraphrase is you take the text and you paraphrase it in a way that makes sense in the receptor language.
Now I'm going to say something shocking. You can use any of these translations as long as you know why you want to use it. Each of these translation methods is useful. What? Well, let me tell you, if you've never read through the Older Testament, you've never done that. You might have belonged to a group that said we're going to read through the Bible this year, and it's going to be the Old Testament, and we're going to start with Genesis 1, and then we're going to do Exodus, and then we're going to do Leviticus, and you give up about Leviticus 3, and basically you're done. So here's an idea. You want to know what the content is of the Older Testament. You want to read it for yourself. Read it as a whole thing rather than I'm just going to read a paragraph. Then you should read one of these paraphrased versions. You should read the Living Scriptures version. It reads like a movie script. Well, that won't be accurate. No, once again, it depends on what you're doing it for. It's extremely accurate if you just want the plot. If you want the plot of what happened to the judges, read one of the paraphrased ones because you will enjoy it a lot more. You'll stick with it a lot longer. Now, if you're going to study individual vocabulary words in the Older Testament, do not use a paraphrase because it's going to be hit and miss whether they use the same what do I say? Just popped on my head. Whether they use the same actual English word for Hebrew word. You're not going to necessarily find it so much, and it's not going to be in the same place as in the sentences. So you can use every kind of translation for different things, but you shouldn't use the wrong translation for your purposes. Is that made? So I'm going to urge you to not always read the Bible in the same version. What? But if there's one or two that are better translations, why wouldn't I read those? If you've read a translation and that's all you've really read and you've never really read other translations, you have missed stuff in the Bible. And you're so jaded and everything is so, you could basically repeat after me and know what your version says. But then you're missing what other translations do better. And each translation has pluses and minuses depending on the editorial staff. So is that, I think my turn is done for now.
Yeah.
I hope I shocked you. I use different Bibles all the time. Well, I can't remember anything if I don't see my underlinings. And your underlinings are going to hold you back eventually. If all you ever read is the Bible you underlined in 30 years ago, you won't read it with fresh eyes. And you need to read it sometimes where you don't know where the next three words are going to say. Okay.
I'm going to start. I'm going to start with clearing my throat. And then I'm going to start with the commercial. We will deal with translations and their usages in the hermeneutics class in the fall as part of the introduction part of that particular course. So if you're interested to see how that works out and how it works out in context, by all means, sign up for that course. If you're reading, to build on what Patrice said, if you're reading a passage of scripture, and by passage of scripture, please don't just read a verse or two, but read in at least a paragraph, if not a chapter or several, to get a context of what's going on. Because these authors wrote the books to be read as a whole, not piecemeal, which is why we recommend that before you begin the study of a book, you read through it at least a couple times. That gives you the opportunity to read through it in a couple different translations. First time through, a paraphrase would be really good because you can read through it really quickly. And you get the basic thrust and flow. Now, these are going to be disconnected asides that reflect on what Patrice has shared with us. So the next thing by way of a reflection here is for those who you encounter, or if you have this hesitation yourself, you really feel that it's important to have a word-for-word translation, please remember what Patrice said. There is no direct word-for-word equivalence from one language to another. Let me give you two examples of if you were using a word-for-word translation, you'd run afoul or run afield. If someone took the English sentence that began, "The White House said," we here in the United States understand what is said by the White House said. Today, yes. But if you were to translate that into another language, the people that would be on the receiving end would look at you kind of strangely. Oh, these people have talking houses. And in fact, the white one talks an awful lot.
Doesn't make sense a lot of times.
And doesn't make sense a lot of times, however you want to go with that. So you can see the problems with a word-for-word translation. Let me reverse that. Word for word, in the Older Testament, I'm particularly thinking of one text in 1 Samuel, talks about somebody or someone else who uncovered their feet. Does that mean they were sleeping in bed and they were too warm, so they had to uncover their feet so they cool off a little? Were they wearing shoes that they needed to get rid of because they were going to walk through water? No, that's an idiom for saying that someone, for lack of a way to put it, better way to put it, used a restroom, used a local restroom. I know in those days they didn't have a local restroom, but you understand they went and utilized a site for that purpose. You translate that word for word, what do you get? You don't get anything that makes sense as intended by the authors themselves. because those are something we call idioms. And you have idiomatic translations as well, which translates things so that the idioms are taken into account. And an idiom in the receiving language. Well, no, let me change that. An idiom in the native language or the original language is then brought into the receiving language in a way that's understood by the person reading it, even if there's no equivalent idiom available. There is an equivalent idiom available, then you'll use that. Now, if you are looking through the text and you're trying to see how a word is used from one text to another text to another text, then you will want a literal word for word. No, I won't change. Let me pull the word literal out. Then you'll want a word for word translation, because then you'll see where else that particular word was used.
You're going to study the vocabulary word.
Yep.
You're not reading to be enlightened about the plot. You are studying a particular word. Therefore, you want the word equivalent to be, what other verses have this Hebrew word or this Greek word? I want to see what other verses have this particular vocabulary word. And that is a fine search if you want to do it.
Mhm.
Right.
Now, if again, read through a book all the way through in one translation, and read through it in another translation, and then read through it in a third translation. In fact, just to get a feel for how the book goes. Look, one of the most popular of what's so-called word-for-word translations is the New American Standard Version, or it's one of the variations on theme. It's very, very well done for its purpose and for its approach. A basic sentence equivalent translation, by and large, is the New International Version. It's very well done for the way it presents itself. So you take the sentence in the original and you provide an equivalent a sentence in the translated, in the translation itself. A dynamic equivalent is one step further. I'm trying to think of a good dynamic equivalent. To some degree, I think this works. What used to be known as the Good News for Modern Man, or the Good News Bible, I forget what it is.
Today's English
Version. Thank you.
used to be known as Good News for Modern Man, which seems like old-timey.
Very old-timey.
Yeah.
But
I guess women couldn't read it or something, or couldn't understand.
Today's English version tends to be a dynamic equivalent kind of translation that does it at a level of vocabulary that would not be beyond, I would say, middle school.
Yes, middle school. This version, which is called Good News for Modern People, I'm just going to change that title, or Today's English Version, was originally translated for a specific purpose. It was translated for people whose first language was not English. So it used simplified vocabulary. It did not use highfalutin phrases or theological, mind-blowing ideas. It was made for people who didn't understand English extremely well, that weren't experts at English. So there was a reason for that version. And when that version then was picked apart by Bible-believing Christians, the criticism that they pointed to the most was, it doesn't say the word blood. It said the word life. Guess what? In a lot of contexts, especially in the Older Testament, the blood meant the life. So for people who attack a version that's trying to make things more understandable for people who are not expert English speakers, it did fine. because it really is more accurate in a lot of places, instead of saying the blood, meaning the life there. Is that
Yeah,
a good example?
Yeah.
So, if a translator is because you have translation teams, sometimes you have a translation person, and sometimes a translation person is all you need. It has certain advantages. Sometimes a team has advantages, but you should know that when you have a translation team and the people the men that are on the team disagree with each other, it happens more regularly than you'd like to think, about how to exactly translate that phrase or that word. There's a minority report and there's a majority report. And the majority report wins. And that word goes in the translation, whether or not it's the more accurate word or the correct word. See how that can really get you in trouble. Now you've been depending upon this team, and you would think that they would all agree 100% of the time, but they don't. And all of these people are usually very highfalutin scholars and very good at their subject, but they don't always agree. And when it's not agreed upon, sometimes they'll put it in the margin by saying, or this word. So you have the word in the text, the majority word, and then you go to the footnote and it says, or this word. And that's the word that lost the vote. And there's going to be problems with that, isn't there? There are going to be problems with that situation. Another thing that you should know about, if you're looking up verses that are problem verses that people don't understand, or when they think they understand it and they're misunderstanding it, because no, that verse doesn't mean this. No, it means this. So that Bible can't be right, and those scholars can't be right because it really means this over here. When you have that situation where they look at the vocabulary word, they look at the word in Greek or Hebrew, and they don't know how to translate it. What do you think they do first if they don't know how to translate it? It's maybe occurs only once in the Bible. What do you think they do? They go back and look at the history of the way it's been translated before. Do you see what a problem that might be? Because if the way it has been translated down through the centuries is actually mistaken, then you're just taking it back to the same old mistakes that were there back in the 1500, back even in Roman times. So if there's a discussion about what a word means, I would say maybe don't go back to the history of the word, because then you're just going to repeat the same mistakes, the same mistaken ideas over and over, and no progress will be made if everybody's agreeing with what they said in 1500. Do you want to talk about the texts that are used in different versions?
Maybe further towards the end.
Okay.
What are some of your favorite translations?
Some of my favorite translations?
Yes. And Bibles for other, you like the study Bible and that kind of stuff. I'm going to check on the AC again. Okay.
Yeah, our air conditioning is failing to pick up steam and cool us off. So he's going to go check on that. As I said, I use a variety of different Bibles, translations. Footnotes do help me. So I do consider the footnotes, and if they've been helpful to me, as far as explaining something, or as you might imagine, after all these decades that John and I have been in trying to vaguely become experts in the Jewish backgrounds of Scripture, especially for John in the New Testament, the Jewish backgrounds of the New Testament. There are certain specific verses that people generally get totally wrong, or they've translated it fine, but then they give you a footnote that's totally wrong. That we sort of look up different verses in that way to sort of say, yeah, we don't need this version. Please also, people need to realize that I have something called the Archaeological Bible. I really enjoy it. It's wonderful. It's unique footnotes taken from archaeology put into a New International Bible Version. So there are many different kinds of Bibles where the only thing that's different from other Bibles is the footnotes and the essays and the pictures and how many pictures they have and who's doing the explanation of what's going on. So having said that, I have used the New International Version because it seems like most of the modern historical and archaeological Bibles, in other words, that have explanations of various things, come with the New International Version. I also use, for the Older Testament, I use a one-person translation, and it's called, I forgot the technical name of it, but the rabbi is Rabbi Ariel Kaplan, Kaplan, and he translated the first 5 books of Moses. But the interesting thing about it is, and it's interlinear, so that I can go to the English and then find the Hebrew over here on the facing page. That I enjoy, that I can easily study from. But his footnotes, it's all about his footnotes and his explanations in the footnotes, because he includes a lot. If I would like to, I don't usually, if I would like to look up discussion about this particular verse in the Talmud, he gives me the designation so I can't. He gives me the addresses so I can look them up other places. He also, on particular verses, he gives you what famous ancient or older rabbis have translated this phrase or this sentence as, and he'll say, this will be Abravanel said it was this, and Ibn Ezra said it was this, and he takes different rabbis' interpretations and he puts them down for you, which I also find extremely helpful in my work, because there is something to be said about the rabbis who work with the text for literally now thousands of years, and their historical background about the way they understood different strange texts, what they understood them to mean. So I do find that helpful. If you're dealing with a Christian Bible, then maybe it will be helpful and maybe it won't. I will say this problem really comes up in the Gospels, because we've got a lot of Greek scholars and they don't know anything about Jewish anything. And so they will take a literal translation, literal. Like it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man, right? It's a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. That is an outrageous metaphor, but it's also a historical detail, because there was a gate called the Eye of the Needle. So what then is Yeshua saying in that particular set of verses? Your understanding of the historical situation may have everything to do with how it should be translated. And it's not just a metaphor. It's not just a nice metaphor, which is a figure of speech to help us, because we really don't know what it means. No, we do know what it means, and it was literal. And you find that Yeshua did not make that up himself. He's quoting the Talmud. And one of the most useful things, I think, that he's been working on has been how much of what Yeshua says is Talmudic.
Not that he's quoting the Talmud, but it's also found in
That
the
it's
Talmud.
found, it was part of his everyday life and his everyday study. The Talmud was what they used to interpret. And people think that Yeshua made it up, and he didn't make that up.
Yeah, the Talmud begins to be codified about 150 to 200 years after Yeshua, but its teachings were in place in oral form, many of them that go back into the Second Temple period. So it's all concurrent rabbinic and theological discussion. Yeshua enters into there.
Yes, so I don't know if we're helping at all with,
Well, I was hoping you mentioned the Kaplan version.
yes, that's an example of one person who did a very good version. There are several New Testaments that are one version, one person translations that are extremely good and helpful. There's the Phillips Bible, the Phillips New Testament, very enjoyable. It was done by a British like literature professor, I think. Very enjoyable. He really knows how to make memorable turns of phrases, which, once again, when we're reading the scripture, I think the optimal thing is it's so memorable to us, we don't forget it. At least that's the way I want to remember things. It's so memorable to me. It's so clear that I want to remember it this way, because it finally, it dawned on me that this made it clear. There are other New Testament, there's the the Cotton Patch Gospels. Oh my gosh. Yeah, Cabbage Patch Kids wrote a gospel. But the most troubling things, which I'm not sure it's fair to say that you find more in the New Testament, but the New Testament examples to me are more striking, is when people fail to recognize something as a figure of speech. So we quote this verse, and if we take it, we can't, we have to do the vocabulary words. And really what it is a figure of speech. Something like half of all human communication is figures of speech. What? Yes. And how do we know this? Because people come to learn a different language, and they're in the country where they speak that language. And all those basically have to be explained. They all have to be explained. I'll give you an example. So our friend Corinne, who was a doctoral student along with him, and he got to know Corinne very well. And she was one of my professors, because I'm younger. So anyway, here's what she said. She came from Belgium, and she got to America, and she goes, I don't know anything about baseball. And there are so many phrases that people in America just automatically know what they mean. And I had no idea what that meant. For instance, anything having to do with 3 strikes, you're out. She didn't know what that meant. Think of baseball, what you hear at baseball games or how they're described on the radio. So he struck out. She didn't know what that meant. She thought maybe somebody was hitting someone. And we can laugh. But do you see what the problem is? If people all around you are using metaphors and not using the clear sense of the word, like to strike out, you can strike out in a ball game, which has nothing to do with hitting anyone. But you can strike out with a sword and kill someone. So context, context, context. That's the situation that we find ourselves in the Older Testament in Hebrew and the Newer Testament in Greek. That we need to spend more time understanding metaphors. Give them an example of the evil eye. If your eye is evil, you should pluck it out. He's going to look it up for your application.
Hopefully I can find it quickly enough.
Okay, he's hoping you can find it quickly enough. I bet you can. Yeah, there it is.
No, that's an eye for an eye.
Oh,
It's a different one.
you want me to look for it?
I'm thinking it's the Sermon on the Mount. Mm-hmm. I'm not finding it. By the way.
He's not finding it. And you can't remember it well enough to talk about it in general.
How much of it do you remember?
It has to do with if your eye is something, then something happens. And it has to do with your stinginess.
Yes.
It doesn't have to
Is
do
it
with
Matthew
what you
6,
see.
22?
Matthew 6:22. Thank you, helpful. He's looking there.
Yes. Very good.
Treasures in heaven.
I was in Matthew 6, but I hadn't found it there. So thank you, Skylar. Okay. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. Okay. But you'd already begun to explain it, so continue.
So it has to do with stinginess, not with sight, not with being full of darkness and full of light. It has to do with your financial generousness, generosity.
Generous.
I can't. I have no endings on my words anymore. Generosity, which is not what people would know if you just are translating the Greek word for word. But if you're a Talmudic scholar, you would know this because this is a topic in the Talmud. And once again, the New Testament writers assumed that everybody knew the way that sayings were interpreted from the Talmud. Is that, have I explained that?
And if you, usually people will just read verses 22 and 23, which I read most of. But if you bothered to read the verses that preceded, you'll see that this preceding paragraph did exactly what we talked about, set it up contextually. It talks about don't lay up treasures for yourself on earth, but do lay them up in heaven. Again, that's a quotation of something the rabbis taught frequently, but you'll catch the point. This whole section has to do with how you handle money and treasure or your economics. You need to have a heavenward focus. You need to have a peopleward focus. And so you can see how the two thoughts interconnect. If you had read the whole thing in its context, it wouldn't have seemed as much out of place when it talks about the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is good, your whole body is full of light. Now, if you read that very literally, you can see the image that's going on, but you don't understand what the image is intended to convey apart from the contextual or historical background. Something else popped into my mind when I was just saying that. Maybe it'll come back in, but let me give you another example that builds on the same kind of thing. This was something that happened a number of years ago. Somebody was working, I forget whether it was in the State Department or the Defense Department, and they were playing with the language computers at that time. And just for the fun of it, they thought they'd take the phrase out of sight, out of mind. They had the computer translated into Russian, and then they had the computer translated back from Russian into English.
We all know it, out of sight, out of mind, is
Right.
in the kind of situations that we would say that in, right? If somebody or something goes away, you don't think about them.
All right, translating the Russian back in English. Here's what came back out in English. Out of sight, out of mind, invisible and insane. So you can see, and that gets us back to word for word. It also gets us back to the whole business of idioms. It has to do with the whole broader area of cultural, contextual, understanding, reading, translation, the whole package. Patrice mentioned before, footnotes. You want to have a translation and a version of the translation that has the footnotes. Not all NIV translations have the footnotes. Not all New American Standard Version Bibles.
They definitely don't all have footnotes.
Don't have the footnotes. But you want the margin and the footnotes in the version of that translation that you're using. Patrice mentioned a couple Bibles that are helpful. The one I have here in front of me that's also on my shelf that I often reach for is the NIV Study Bible, because the Study Bible notes are very helpful. But there's one problem with the NIV Study Bible. I don't know how many Jews, if any, were involved in its construction. I'm sure there may have been a couple Messianic Jews involved. Well, how do you resolve that whole issue? Well, you get the Jewish Study Bible. And because that'll bring to bear some of the stuff that Patrice was mentioning with the Kaplan translation. It brings in the whole wisdom of that whole heritage of and tradition of interpreting the texts by and from Jewish sources.
Okay, but that also points out one of my problems with it, which was I'll give you an example. For the notes for Jeremiah. So every book has notes in
Even in the Jewish Study Bible version?
the Jewish Study Bible. You mean the
None?
JPS?
Yes.
Oh, no. The JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, has a Bible called the Jewish Study Bible. It is a non-Messianic Jewish Bible, and so its notes are not Messianic at all. And it can be helpful. I've read any classes that I teach, and I usually read through the notes they have in that particular version. But once again, any Messianic prophecy that you might look up in the Jewish Study Bible, it's going to say Christians see this as Messianic, but of course it's not because of the following reasons. So, as I said, some notes will be extremely helpful, and then there's other notes that will not be helpful at all about understanding Messianic prophecy. I was going to say something, but I don't remember. Oh, I was going to say, so the Messianic Bible that's called...
The Messianic Jewish Study Bible, I think is what it's called.
Yeah, it's called the Complete Messianic Jewish Study Bible, or the Messianic Jewish Study Bible, which is a Messianic version published by, what's the name of the publishing house?
It's not Hendrickson?
Yes, well, originally by Hendrickson.
Yeah.
Here's one of my objections to it. So I spent a long time creating footnotes and notes to be put in the margins for basically the 12 minor prophets. I also did Ruth and Esther, and I did Jeremiah. However, one of the editors said, I have a brilliant idea. Why don't we put my professor and his notes? Why don't we put his notes? Because he's a very, very fine believer. He teaches at some Bible college. And so they put his notes, this professor's notes, in the book of Jeremiah. And I had already read the professor's notes. And here's what the notes were like. Well, once again, the Jewish people are letting God down, and God is going to punish them for their lack of belief. He says it like every 5 verses. The Jewish people are going to suffer because of this kind of a decision. The Jewish people, these are poor decisions that they make, and so they must be punished. He repeated it over and over and over. And do you see how distressing that is? Do you see how that, why even have a Bible where it's basically bringing out the failure of the Jewish people every single page? And not really helping you with Jeremiah very much, other than Jeremiah knew that they were going to be judged. Well, when you just read the book of Jeremiah, that's not your overriding thought about that. Not as much as it was for the professor. And so that is something that I think we're both disturbed about when we read in the notes, usually, sometimes in a poor translation, but in the notes and the footnotes and the descriptions and the short articles they have before each of the various books. If there's information in those things that is designed to make Jewish people look bad and designed to help Christians feel that, thank goodness, they're never going to do this like the Jewish people did, then that's anti-Semitic in its effect. They didn't intend that, maybe. That's not what they had in mind. But that's when you keep hitting the nail with a hammer over and over and over and over again, you're giving a strong message, which is Jews didn't make it. Jews are bad. Jews went against what God wanted. Christians are loved. Christians are forgiven. We don't have to worry about that. And so it's, for me, it's distressing. It's distressing to, after how many decades we've been in this, to see it doesn't seem to get better. It seems to get worse. I was going to say the one example of a translation that doesn't communicate is the verse, Messiah is the end of the law in James.
No. Romans 10.
Oh, sorry. That's why I couldn't find
That's
it.
why I couldn't find it in James. No, because the related term for end is found in James.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you want to start that from the beginning better than I could?
No, you,
No, I'm asking you.
oh, okay.
He's the New Testament person.
Romans 10:4 says the Messiah is the end of the law for righteousness in many translations.
Yes. Messiah is the end of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes.
And so it's often then thought that when Yeshua the Messiah came, he put an end to the law. Well, first of
The law
all,
has ended.
let's remember that the translation of law in itself is somewhat problematic because the term Torah does not mean law. It means instruction or guidelines. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is this, and I believe it occurs in James 5.
Guess what? It's not in the notes of this particular Bible,
What?
the James passage.
No, it wouldn't be.
So the verse we're looking at is Romans 10, verse 4.
Yeah. Um,
And you're looking in James 5
Yeah.
now.
Maybe it's not in James 5. It's a text that says you have heard of the patience of Job, and you've seen the literal translation is the same term that's found in Romans 10. You've seen the end of the Lord. Many translations refer to it there as purpose, but it's the same Greek term both in Romans 10 as in, but I had it there for a second.
I don't see,
I saw a text that said patience.
I don't see Job anywhere.
Okay.
James 5:11.
Thank you.
There we go. Rowan to the rescue once again.
Start with 10.
Yeah, see, I had gotten to verse 8. Yeah, Yes, there it is. You've heard Joe's, yeah, and you've seen what the Lord has finally brought about is what the translation has here.
It says, you have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. That word finally brought about is the same word as what you find in Romans 10.
It's the
It's
Greek,
not the end. However, that's the interpretation that most people have memorized. It should be the goal.
purpose.
Messiah is the purpose or the goal of the law, which is different from the end, that's it, it's dead, it must be thrown away.
Yeah, the Greek term there is telos, and you hear that term telos in other, as it bleeds over into English, teleological. That has to do with something that has a purpose. So, on the other hand, both the term end and goal, we have metaphors for, or we have, maybe the figures of speech for. I'm not going to reflect on the our local team's season this past year, football wise, but our championship level team occasionally did not cross the goal line into the end zone. That's the idea of end or goal that this term telos has to do with. So if you shift that metaphor into this into this text of scripture, and imagine Yeshua as the goal line or the end zone, in that sense, the purpose of the Torah, and that it all points to him and he's central to it. He doesn't end it, but he's central to it, and its purpose points towards, or it points to him as being the purpose of God's program in our world.
It's like if you're playing a game, when you reach the Messiah, you win.
Or at least you score.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to segue into something related. I see that.
I just haven't looked at it.
We just have a couple of minutes left, which is disadvantages of the King James Version. So I'm just going to deal with one of those disadvantages, and it has to do with what we've just been talking about for the past 20 minutes. With the King James translators that were brought together by King James, he was not the greatest Christian ever. And having the Bible version translated into English was not his redemption. It was a very good thing for that time period. Here's what the King James translators did on purpose. Remember when we talked about if you're doing a word study and all you know is English, you're going to look for English words that one word you're hoping in English will be the same Greek word all the way through. So if in Greek a word was the same, then in English, you're hoping that the word is going to be the same.
Translated the same in each case.
Translated the same or very close in each case, not in the King James. The King James translators on purpose translated Greek words by different words on purpose. Why would they do that on purpose? Because one of their goals was to enhance English. So King James was not just a Bible believer and loved the Bible. He politically was trying to get English into a more polished and more sophisticated language compared with Latin or Greek or Hebrew. And so on purpose, they would take the same Greek word and in different places translate it as something different, related but different, because they wanted to increase people's vocabulary. Do you see how that might make it really difficult to understand what the original Greek word meant. And so that's one strike against. If we're going to talk about striking out, that's one strike against the King James. The King James, he's not the more perfect Bible, even though I would say the generation before ours, basically the King James that was really the top, and everything else was just not worth it. The thing that King James has going for it is it still sounds good when you read it out loud. When you read the New American Standard Version out loud, it just doesn't sound as good. It sounds halting. It's not poetic at all. So if you're trying to find a Bible that's good for public reading out loud, don't pick the New American Standard. Yeah. So there's advantages and disadvantages to all these Bibles, and advantages and disadvantages to the notes and the footnotes that they put in the versions. Because Lord knows there's so many versions. Like, look at this one. I just picked it up out of the library. It's called International Inductive Study Bible. But it's the New International Version, but all the footnotes are. So you can do inductive Bible study. Inductive Bible study was really the way to go in the 70s and 80s. That was a big thing. They were marketing a lot of inductive Bible study. And this last semester, when I was chatting with my students during class, I go, yeah, inductive Bible study. They looked at me like I was speaking Martian. What do you mean by inductive Bible study? I went, you guys don't know what inductive Bible study is? Well, it's sort of hard to explain, like, in 30 seconds. You'd have to experience it and learn how to do it, which is what we used to have to do in the 70s and the 80s. So all you new generations, I'm not sure that inductive Bible study answers as many questions as they think it should answer, but it is another method of learning what the Bible says. If you're an English speaker, it can assist you.
And I might say it's a very important method, and we'll deal with that as well in hermeneutics class.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't.
Do you actually make them do some
Yes.
so that they know what it is they're doing it and why it's different?
And why it's important, yes. So in that sense, we've come full circle, but I want to come full circle in another sense, and that's where we began. Please, if you're associated with the Messianic movement, do not assume that the Messianic Bibles are the be-all and end-all. All the ones that we have available and that we have in fact talked about from the outset of this time together have their flaws and their weaknesses. And I don't think we could give a wholehearted recommendation to any of them. Not that they're not useful, they are, but without reservation. Yes, that's a better way to put it.
Especially if they're asking you to pay $25 for one. You might get lucky. And if you went to your public library, here's the thing that most public libraries have, which is a whole bunch of different Bibles. So they have all the versions of all the Bibles that people have given them or bought for them. So go to your local library, look under Bible versions, and you'll be shocked and amazed at how many Bible versions there are. If they have a copy of one or either of these particular Bibles, then I'd take it out and try it. It's like, I'm going to take it for a trial drive. I'm going to tool it around the block and see if it's helpful and helping me before you spend your hard-earned money.
Now, the Messianic Study Bibles do have one thing that they do contribute, particularly in the area of the Newer Testament, and that is they try to provide you with terms and names that are in fact Jewish, so that so you are constantly reminded that this is Jewish material. If you're reading an older testament that is published by a Jewish publication society, you'll get the same kind of thing.
What kind of thing?
in that you'll get Jewish terms and names for these places and people and events. With the Messianic translations, some do a wonderful job of that. Some go perhaps a little overboard, and you're reading these things and you're wondering who these people are or what these terms are, because in some cases you get some Hebrew terms that have been anglicized. You get some cases you get some Yiddish terms that have been anglicized or at least incorporated here in an English version. And sometimes that gets in the way of your reading and your study. I was trying to think of this. If you are familiar with the Older Testament, this may be helpful, this particular illustration. Daniel had three friends. Right? He ended up in the lion's den. They ended up being put up for toast. And if you know the stories from of old, you'll know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But if you read them in the Jewish translation, Hananiah, Zechariah, and if I remember right, Mishael. Now, if you grew up with the stories about the Daniel's friends being Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and you read Hananiah, Zechariah, Mishael, you'll go, who? Now, that's helpful in getting you rooted in something Jewish, but it can become an obstacle to overcome as you're reading and you're trying to make connections.
And Hananiah is the actual name of Ananias. Ananias is the Greek version of the name Hananiah. So there's something even in the using the Hebrew names for Bible characters that would remind Jewish readers, if they read about Ananias and Sapphira, if they read that story and they knew his name was Hananiah, how shameful, isn't it? That somebody with this very famous hero in Israel does this horrible, nasty thing and steals the money belonging to the Lord. I mean, there's those kinds of things that may not be earth-shaking, but they do say so much. They do say so much about the context of the New Testament, just by knowing what their Hebrew names were, rather than their English names and or Greek names. Is that fair enough?
So the point is that cuts both ways. You get to make the connections, you get to see that they're Jewish, but sometimes if you're reading in English, you get tripped up with these Hebrew names and the occasional Yiddish terms or names as well.
Okay. That happens more in David Stern's Bible. So David, we love him desperately. He's a very good friend, and he's really a good scholar and has had a very interesting life. He lives in Israel. He's the one that did
The Jewish New Testament.
the Jewish New Testament
And the complete Jewish Bible.
and the complete Jewish Bible. He gets his Yiddish and his Hebrew mixed up.
Well, I don't know about mixed up, but mixed in.
Mixed in together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Yiddish is a language that was invented, I'm going to say, starting in 1200 AD. It's different from Hebrew. Yiddish has a lot of Hebrew words in it. But the Yiddish that Seinfeld used in his TV show, or that Borscht Belt comedians use, that is not Hebrew. It's a German-based language. So if you know some German, you can understand quite a bit of what's being said with some leftover Hebrew words. So let me give you an example. The Hebrew word for a thief is ganef. And the Marx Brothers used a lot of Yiddish in their bits that they brought with them from vaudeville. They had, the Marx Brothers, played off each other. And then later on, these kinds of things were put into the scripts of movies that they made. But their earliest expression was in New York City with a New York City audience. And they used quite a few Yiddish words. So in one movie, he plays a lawyer, Groucho plays a lawyer, whose name is Ganef, which means thief in Hebrew. It's a joke. See how that works? If you know some Yiddish and realize that Yiddish is related to Hebrew, has a bunch of Hebrew words in it, but is really a Germanic base that was invented after the people left the Holy Land. After the Jewish people left the Holy Land, they went to the Northwest. They went to Germany, and living in German-speaking regions, they retained some of their Hebrew language knowledge, plus added a German base. But look, Hebrew is not the same as Yiddish.
So it adds a Jewish flavor to the whole package, but if you're not familiar with the terminology, it becomes somewhat of an impediment to understanding. So it has both good and
Bad.
bad. Yeah.
Frankly, I know if you've come into the synagogue, we talk about the two major world groupings of Jews, which are Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Jews. So the Ashkenazic ones are basically in northwestern Europe, so Germany and points north, and Sephardic are to the southeast, so northern Africa and over into the Arab nations since the Babylonian captivity. And these two types of Hebrew are, I don't want to say dialects, they are two different forms. In written form, they're perfectly fine and they're equivalent, but it's in the pronunciation where it's slightly different, slightly different. And all the comedian words from New York City, those are Ashkenazi and Yiddish. The Sephardi people have something that's like Yiddish, but it's based in Spanish. It's called Ladino. And so if you know Ladino, you pretty much have a handle on Spanish. If you know Yiddish, you pretty much have a handle on German. And it's two sides and two different parts of Hebrew in the world today, are these two different versions. And continually thinking and obsessing about Yiddish and how funny it is and how great it is, you're leaving out half of the world Jews because they're doing Sephardi. And unfortunately, that's what happened to their experience in Israel, too. They were left out by the Ashkenazic Jews. So the Sephardic Jews have never made a name for themselves and also were the socioeconomic class that Sephardic Jews lived in even in Israel, is lower. So, be aware that there are other ways of having Jewish languages. Both Ladino and Ashkenazi Yiddish are perfectly fine Jewish languages, but that's what they are. They're languages that are used by Jews in different parts of the world.
Okay, final answer to the question in one sense is this. If you come to our synagogue, you will find in the pews not one, but two of the so-called Messianic Bibles. We have the complete Jewish Bible from our friend David Stern, and we also have the Living Scriptures, which is the Jewish version of the Living Bible, if you want to put it that
More
way.
terminology rather than.
Totally, yeah.
So they've
Not
taken the Greek names out of the New Testament and replaced them with Hebrew names.
Exactly. So that's what we got. That's what we use here, in case you're wondering what we use here. And with that being said, having wandered around this whole field of translation
I'm tired out now.
and a bit of linguistics and interpretation, if we're done unless you have a question. First, either of you two.
She'elot? Now I'm going to just speak Hebrew.
Okay.
Yesh ilot. Are there any questions?
From the-
Ken?
Okay,
Ken?
those
I
of
have
you,
one.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
two.
Tyler,
Skylar, speak up.
Yes. Are you familiar with the New English Translation and the annotated Jewish New Testament by Amy Jill Levine? Are you familiar with either of those? And what are your quick thoughts on them? Good, bad mix.
thank you for bringing that. Fleeted through my mind a couple times. The annotated Jewish New Testament, once again, is very helpful. It's helpful in what it brings by way of Jewish insights to these texts that not just Christians, but Jews have studied. So it has that as an advantage. Some of the articles in the back are very good. And in fact, I think one of them is a required reading for the hermeneutics course itself, because it's so good.
But
But some of what these
these are Jewish scholars.
Jewish scholars, and we have met and interacted briefly with Amy Jill Levine. Wonderful person, excellent scholar, but
She has a good heart.
got a good heart. And she's not the only one. I forget who the guy is who is.
Yeah, the other one. Yeah.
And he's fine. He's great too. But too often they have brought into these Jewish texts, as they try to make it an annotated Jewish Bible, they brought into it Christian perspectives that aren't necessarily Jewish.
So when I read a couple of the articles, I was pretty shocked at how inaccurate their understanding was. Not Amy Jill, but the other guy.
And it varies from, and depending on who it is, but it varies from, it too varies from book to book and from note to note.
Here's something that most Jewish people do not understand the difference. Here's what, like, there are some who do get it, but it's very, very few statistically. Most Jewish people do not know the difference between Protestants and Catholics. So they'll be talking along about something or other, and then they'll talk about a crucifix in the Presbyterian church. No, doesn't happen. Happens about as often as they have a pig roast in a Reformed temple. No. So it's that kind of stuff that even among educated people, you would think that they would know the difference between Catholics and Protestants, but no, they don't. As a matter of fact, if you ask the next 100 people to walk in Target, what's the difference between Protestants and Catholics? Most of them wouldn't get it right either.
I have a specific axe to grind with the annotated Jewish Bible, study Bible people, and that is, in some cases, not in all cases, where texts of the Newer Testament have been historically interpreted anti-Semitically, they too have fallen into the same trap.
Gospel of John is the most famous one that's been labeled anti-Semitic.
And so you will not get help there.
And John is the most Jewish gospel of all.
So that's why I say they've brought some, that's what I meant by they brought some Christian tradition perspective into it. And in this particular case, in a very unhelpful way, because all these texts have historically been treated and interpreted anti-Semitically in some of the cases in the annotated Jewish Study Bible. They have not gotten beyond that anti-Semitic interpretation of some of these crucial texts. Again, a lot of good in there, but again, there are some weaknesses.
Got to sort it out.
But that now brings us totally full circle to Kabbalah. There's some good in there, but you gotta sort it out.
As what a good friend of ours, her father used to say, got to separate the pepper from the flea poop.
And he used a different term for poop.
Yes. but that's what you have to do. And they look alike. They look alike. So it's hard to differentiate, but that's what you need. If it's worth doing that, then God bless you.
Yeah, so have several translations, compare the translations, have the various study Bibles, utilize the study Bibles. They all bring something good and relevant, but you've got to be discerning, which means you got to be on the top of your game. How do you get discerning? How do you get to the top of your game? Final commercial. St. Petersburg Seminary and Yeshiva will help you greatly.
Well, it'll help. You have to put in the
Work,
but
yes. All right.
I think these,
thank-
I think these sessions, I've learned a lot from any time that I'm here with Stump, and I think they're fabulous. I always come away with something, always.
that's a very high compliment for us.
Thank you very much, and we love having you be part of it. And I want to commend you, Skylar, for getting us to a couple of the texts a little
Yes,
faster than we
so
did.
helpful. Very, very helpful. Thank you.
I did have a computer to cheat with.
I think you need to pray to close us.
Yes, I will do that. Thank you, Father, for this time that we've had. Thank you that you've given us your time of day, in bringing us to yourself, and in leaving behind for us your guidelines in these texts that we've interacted with, and these wonderful books that should guide our walk with you. So thank you that we've had these times to better understand them, to interact with each other as to how to better implement them in our lives. And so may that be the result as we walk away from our time together. As we look forward to, as we like to say at this time of day, on this particular day, Shavua Tov, a good week.
Have a good week.
Thank you because of Yeshua.
Lahitaot.
And
Good night.
Shavua Tov. Have a great week.
one more thing.
Uh-oh.
Betty dropped off before the one more thing. The date of our next get
I
together.
don't know when that is.
I happen to know that. I'll double check it. I believe it's August 27th. If that's
Oh,
a Saturday.
So long from now. Oh, shoot.
Okay. Yes, August 27th is our next stump. So. Okay.